Welcome to the Know Why podcast. Today we are still exploring the question, is God good? And for some people, or a lot of people, maybe even people listening to the podcast right now, doubts about God's goodness have sparked a deconstruction journey or a crisis of faith. And so that's why I asked Ian Harber to join us on the Know Why podcast today. Welcome, Ian.
Liberty, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk with you.
Yeah, so it's great to talk with you again, Ian. I had the opportunity to interview Ian recently when I was guest hosting for Point of View Radio Talk Show, and it was so good. I knew I had to ask him to come on the Know I podcast as well. So Ian is the Director of Communications and Marketing at Mere Orthodoxy, and he's also the author of this book, which we'll be discussing, Walking Through Deconstruction, How to Be a Companion in a Crisis of Faith. And so, Ian, I think this is going to really just a lot of people are going to relate with this because you've been on your own deconstruction journey. And so I wondered if you could get started by sharing some of that story for us.
Yeah, for sure. And, every story is complicated and messy. I was born in a broken family. From the age of 3, I was raised by my grandparents, and there are lots of reasons for that. And they raised me in a Christian home, and my grandparents were wonderful. I have nothing negative to say about them. They were amazing. Um, Part of, and this is unintentional, but they raised me in some Christian environments that, whether that's the church or schools that I went to, one word you could use for it is maybe fundamentalist. Another word that I've started gravitating towards more is this word anxious. Just this idea that things were very, there was a very narrow way of being a Christian that was focused more on secondary, tertiary, even political issues, more than the kind of ironically, the fundamentals, the core of what has united Christians throughout time and around the globe. And so that's just sort of the environment that I was raised in and was taught that's what being a Christian was. And so then you have kind of a confluence of factors. You have, on one hand, me just trying to figure out my identity and who I am, wrestling through this history of my broken family and like that always being present in my life, that loss of my family just being different than, especially at the time, everyone else is around me. The second thing was just a significant amount of death and suffering. So my grandmother who raised me passed away from cancer the day after Christmas. And that was the first of 12 funerals that I went to over the course of about 2.5 years that ended with my mom taking her own life. So that was a very formative period of time in my life when it was just sort of death after death after death. And, some of those were closer to me than others, but some of it was just a sheer impact of that many deaths in a row. Around that same time, a mentor of mine who, walked with me closely in the church ended up abusing multiple friends of mine and, of course, getting fired from that. And so that was a massive betrayal. So you kind of compound all of those things together. I'm wrestling with a lot in my faith.
Yeah.
So I'm bringing a lot of questions to the people around me, to my pastors, to people at the schools that I'm at, and just being met with a significant amount of resistance. It's not like anybody was even just saying, I don't know, let's figure that out. It was, you can't be asking that. To even be thinking down that line, your salvation is in question. It's like, man, I'm just trying to figure this stuff out. I don't know what I believe and what I don't believe. All I know is life is hard, and I have a lot of questions about God and the Bible and the world and, me and everything. And nobody seems interested in having these conversations. In fact, everybody seems very scared of these conversations. So in all of that, there's only maybe about a year where I would say I wouldn't have used the word Christian for myself. I just kind of discarded the label. After that, I would have called myself a Christian, but I really kind of floated off into more progressive Christian spaces. And so, this is kind of in the waning years of the emergent church movement and kind of the time when the progressive Christian emergent movement was leaving all of their institutions, becoming more of sort of an underground media movement. And so all of those voices were very influential for me, and took me into sub-Christian at best, heretical at worst places, to where even though I was still in Christian environments and in some cases even doing ministry, I just didn't know what I believed about these kinds of things. And in some cases, I believed things that were not Christian. It was a very confusing time. There's no easy way of categorizing these kinds of things. And I think for me, that was part of my hope in writing the book was just sort of talk about that. I think people imagine deconstruction and reconstruction being this very linear process. You kind of backslide out of the faith, and then you have this, intellectual journey back into the faith, and it's not exactly like that.
Mhm.
Um, so if you fast forward a little bit, I graduate college, I get married, and then the year after my wedding, right after my first anniversary, my grandfather who raised me passed away in a plane crash. And that kind of set off a several chain of events, all of which is kind of that was the hardest. I don't know another way to put it. That was the hardest part of my life. That was the
Yeah.
darkest season of my life. That was years long, um, and right before he passed away in that crash, I got accepted into a theological training program at a church in Dallas, and it was sort of if you took seminary and shrank it down into a church. And it was the first time I'd ever gotten formal theological training. And so I went there with all my doubts, all my questions. I was raw. I wasn't trying to hide anything. Just here I am, you know. Um, and the very first day, the teacher stands up and he says, "We do theology in the light so we can stand on it in the dark."
Wow.
And that was exactly what I needed to hear in that moment.
Mhm.
It was a little too late for me, but I just kind of thought, okay, I'm open. I'm here. Let's see what happens.
Mm.
Um, and at the end of that training program, I did not have all my questions answered. I didn't even agree with some of the finer points of things that were taught, on some of those more tertiary issues, but that didn't matter. What really happened there was they looked at the core things that makes Christians Christian. And Jesus has this line in Matthew where he says that every teacher of the law who's a disciple of Jesus's is like someone who goes into the storehouse and brings out treasures new and old. And that is exactly what it felt like. It was like, oh, I had been raised in the church, steeped in Christian environments my whole life. And it was like, where were these things? Like, these aren't just truths to be believed. This changes every single thing about your life if they're real and you take them seriously. And I don't know why nobody ever took the time to teach me these things.
Mm.
And so I don't know, it's kind of a weird, I had someone ask me recently, when were you saved? And I really don't have a good answer for that,
Mhm.
but leaving that sort of felt like another conversion. It just felt like, oh, this is what all this means. And so I really felt like I left that with this settled confidence, this trust in God, trusting that he is good and he is who he says he is and that he loves me and is good, capital G, good. And I had a foundation that I could actually build my life on, build my faith on, build my relationships on. And so that was, there had been some other things that happened before then that I think primed me for that.
Mhm.
But if there was a time that's like, this is sort of the beginning of my real reconstruction, that would be it.
Wow. Thanks so much, Ian, for sharing that. And I'm sorry for your losses too. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing those with us. Life is hard, and there, like you said, everybody's life and story is complicated, and so there can be multiple, factors that go into someone's specific faith journey. And so, we want to acknowledge that too and take the time to do that for listeners too. If you've gone through tragedy and loss and hardship, or you feel like you weren't allowed to ask questions, and whatever it is that you're grieving or have grieved in the past, like that's okay. And it's okay to feel those things. And so again, just thank you for sharing your story, because I think a lot of people can relate to it. And just to kind of continue helping us understand what it might be like for someone who has deconstructed. And I do want to focus later on in the interview more about your reconstruction process too, and the hope that is there. But still, kind of just to help us understand, what are some misconceptions or common misconceptions you think that people have about the deconstruction process? Maybe like if someone's listening and they've been in church for a long time and maybe they haven't personally experienced this, what would you want them to know?
One of the catalysts for me writing this book was that I was paying attention to the conversation surrounding deconstruction and the way the different kind of groups of people were talking about it. And what it seemed to me was that each of the different groups had something true to say about it, but they were missing a significant piece of the puzzle, which took their true thing and kind of made it a not true thing, if that makes any sense. A
Mhm.
half truth turns into a non truth, a lie. And so I felt like I was able to say, I think there's a piece of this puzzle that's missing that actually makes sense of all of these things together. So that's what I try to bring to this. And so a couple of those misconceptions were, some people would just make a almost a one-to-one equation of deconstruction and apostasy. And, I understand why people do that. People deconstruct and they apostatize and leave the faith. Totally get it. That is a real dynamic that happens. And so I think there's something to that. I just don't think you can say that those are the same thing or that deconstruction is necessarily one step on the way to apostasy.
Mhm.
It could be, but I don't think that's an inevitable outcome. And even worse, to be honest, I think if you treat it like an inevitable outcome, this almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to it. Of somebody who's going through that process thinks, oh, I'm losing my faith, therefore this is what's going to happen. It's like, well, not necessarily. One of the arguments I make in the book is that deconstruction, the word hasn't been around for this process for too long, but the experience has been around forever. You look at someone like Augustine, who, he writes about this in Confessions. He has a experience. When does Augustine leave the faith? He leaves the faith at 18 years old, the year after his dad died, and he doesn't have any good things to say about his dad. And he basically spends 10, 12 years leaving the faith, going exploring the Manichees, and it's through a series of experiences that he ends up coming back to God. He basically lays out the exact same process in different words. In fact, he uses the word "the crisis" at one point in Confessions, which I'll come back to that. But so that's one example.
Mhm.
Another example is almost the opposite extreme of that, is people saying, deconstruction is great. All it is just thinking critically. It's just asking questions. Everybody should deconstruct, because why would you not want to think critically and ask good questions about your faith? Deconstruction is absolutely asking questions, no doubt about it. And but I tell a story in the book, and I think this is broadly true. This is certainly true for me. Of a friend of mine who was talking to a friend of theirs about kind of going through deconstruction and what that experience was like, and their friend sort of responded to that like that. That's great. You're thinking critically. You're asking good questions. What's the big deal? And my friend said, "Yeah, I am thinking critically. I am asking good questions about the Bible and women in ministry and whatever else. And I cannot sleep at night. I am absolutely terrified. This
Mm.
is so scary. I feel like I'm losing everything. So what's that?" And I agree with that. I think that is an accurate portrayal of this deconstruction process. It's not just an intellectual undertaking that someone goes through. It's primarily more of an existential and spiritual experience before it's an intellectual experience. And so part of me wanting to even write the book was to flip that, not to get away from the intellectual part of it, but to put it in its proper context, which is under this experience as a crisis of faith. And so the third one would be kind of this group that is very well intentioned, and I like a lot of these people, but they try to take this third way in the middle that says, there's a good kind of deconstruction and a bad kind of deconstruction. Good deconstruction is when you deconstruct with the Bible in the church and community, and bad deconstruction is when you leave and get rid of the Bible and isolate. And there's a sentiment to both of those things that I agree with. I think, yes, I don't want people to leave the Bible in the church, and I agree with that. But when the church and the Bible has been used as a weapon against somebody, and you say, well, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave. But those are the things that have actually caused the harm in their life. It's going to fall on deaf ears. And for good reason. There is a lot of trust that has been broken and needs to be rebuilt. And that's not going to happen just by exhorting them to trust the Bible and keep going to church. That is going to take time. That's going to take trust building. That's going to take relational work on on the part of the person who's walking through with them. And so that's why I wanted to write the book, is to equip that person to help rebuild trust, so that they could trust the Bible and trust the church and those kinds of things. Ultimately trust God through these things. And so those are some of the ways that I see people talk about deconstruction. They're not all wrong. I don't, think they're all bad or anything like that, but I just don't think they're complete. And so
Mhm.
the missing puzzle piece for me was this idea of a crisis of faith. That's the first thing we need to say about deconstruction, is that it's a crisis of faith. It's an existential experience. It's a spiritual experience. Yes, it includes questioning. Yes, it includes an intellectual process that comes in under that. And it might lead to somebody apostatizing. Absolutely. But it doesn't have to do that. And these other things only make sense under this bigger category of a crisis of faith.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that. And I think again, it just you really give voice to a lot of people's experience, and it's important for others to understand too. And I think one of the things that I found um, really helpful in your book was you when you said, most people don't just wake up and say, I'm going to deconstruct today. Like you said, it kind of
Mhm.
happens to you. You find yourself in this crisis because of however many different factors of your upbringing or things that have happened. And it's not necessarily a pleasant journey. It can be very scary for people. So, um, thank you for explaining that. And then another question kind of focused on people who they maybe know somebody who's going through this and they're not deconstructing themselves. They don't maybe feel like they have a spiritual crisis happening, but I think we all know somebody who has, even if we haven't been there ourselves. And we can be eager to respond with answers and apologetics. And it also can be scary too, just to acknowledge, like, for a loved one, and you see somebody that you care about going through this, and you start to worry about their spiritual state. And so you think, I've got to act and I've got to answer their questions and I got to bring them back. But one thing you say, this is a quote from your book, your presence in their life is so much more important than your ability to answer every question. Your demeanor matters more than your apologetics. So, this might be hard for some people, but can you explain what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to kind of the environments that I was raised in, that's a lot of what I was met with, apologetics and worldview training and, these kinds of things. I'm not even against all those things. I think they're good and there's a place for it. But when you're in that scary place of you're wrestling through suffering, you're wrestling through doubt, you're wrestling through your relationships, you're wrestling through cultural issues, um, you really just need to be seen.
Mm,
Seen for who you are, seen for
yeah.
and be understood. And so when somebody comes at you with, here are the five proofs for or whatever, pick your thing, that's not really what's going on. Now, I'm not saying that the conversation isn't important, um, but when that's the first thing that you jump to, it's really easy to just feel shut down. It's just like, oh, this person doesn't even see the fear, honestly, that am experiencing and wrestling through this, and they're just trying to shut me down. And they have their memorized script of what they're supposed to say in a situation like this, and they can't just like relate to me,
Mm,
and even see like, is there anything in what I'm saying that can be validated? Because I feel crazy. Um, and so one of the things that I draw on in the book a lot is this. It's actually a kind of late family systems therapist. His name is Edwin Friedman. He wrote a book, a leadership book called A Failure of Nerve. And it is unlike any other book I've ever read. He's actually not a Christian, but he kind of coined this phrase that the phrase is a non anxious presence. And the way he describes it in the book is if you imagine you're in a crowded room and next thing you know, the room is on fire and everybody in the room is scrambling, going crazy. They're looking for the exits, but they're so panicked they can't even see straight and find it. Then there's that one person in the room who, even though everything around them is crazy, everything is chaos, they're able to be calm, look around, find the exit, and not only get themselves there, but help get others there too. That is kind of a word picture for what a non anxious presence is.
mhm,
And I also think that's a really good picture of what we can be and probably should be in these relationships with people who are deconstructing. It's certainly what I wish somebody was with me. And to be honest, is what I found in that training program that I mentioned earlier of we see the crisis, we know what's going on, We see you, we understand you, and we are not scared of you. You are not a threat to us. We're not scared. We're not worried for you. We know this is going to be hard. We're going to stick with you through this, through thick and thin, and walk with you through it. Yes, that includes intellectual conversations, and we can have those. We can debate if we have to. Um, but the first thing I want you to know is that you are seen, you are loved, you are cared for, you are accepted and welcomed here. And any conversations we need to have are in the context of that. And
Yeah.
being able to be that non anxious presence is, I think, the key to what it means to walk with someone through deconstruction.
Mhm. Yeah. I really loved reading that and thinking in terms of that too. And just like you said, like people want to be seen. And I think a lot of people, they want to know, do you still love me and accept me, even though I'm having these questions, even if I decide that I don't believe this anymore? And I think, from the other person's perspective, it can be tempting to say, well, yes, I love you. That's why I want to give you all this information. But and another thing that you point out is that ultimately we have to trust God. And so a lot of times I think we don't realize it, but our anxiety in that situation is actually us failing to trust God. He tells us not to worry. That includes not worrying about our loved ones. And so we can be a non anxious presence. And that might even be helpful. So, anyway, you do a great job of explaining that. Go ahead.
Well, in the book, I lay out a handful of simple practices for people to think through being a
Mm-hmm.
non anxious presence. But the first one is prayer. And there's really two reasons for that. I mean, the first one is obviously that prayer actually works. Like, God moves in people's lives in ways that we never can. And
Yeah.
he's way more powerful than us and he's way more wise than us. And so, um, that, start there. The second reason is, though, that by even acknowledging that, you release control of that person to God, and for God to love that person, to God to change that person. And then that takes the pressure off of you. You say, God, I can't do something that only you can do. And so it's like, how do I become a non anxious presence? You can't without that. That is the first step of just being able to release them and say, I know I'm worried for them. I know I'm anxious for them. But I can't fix them or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, I can't change this outcome. I can be faithful. I can be loving. I can be caring. Um, but only God is going to move in their hearts in the way that needs to happen. And so I can be in their lives, but not trying to control their lives at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So good. So let's talk about reconstruction. And the last couple questions have kind of been focused maybe on the perspective of somebody who loves a person who is walking through deconstruction. But let's say, okay, you're on that journey yourself. And when you, Ian, were on your reconstruction journey, you point out ways that you learned to readjust your framework. For instance, realizing that you don't have to have 100% certainty about certain convictions in order to hold them. And I think that that's a really big one, even for me as I'm reading it, because there are a lot of things that, I have questions about or wonder about with regard to Christian faith. So, what are some ways that we need to readjust our imagination or our mental framework if we're going to start that reconstruction journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the back half of the book, I basically lay out a few paradigm shifts that it's not so much apologetics, it's more just have you thought about things like this, in
Mm-hmm.
order to help equip people for conversations. And you used a great word there in your question, the word imagination. And I think that is such a key to a lot of this. Again, going back to even the conversation we were just having about arguing with people and apologetics, how even the intellectual side of this is couched in the existential. I think that is a huge flip for people of we are holistic, integrated beings. Jesus calls us heart, soul, mind, strength, or you could say body, and social creatures. Love your neighbor as
Mm-hmm.
yourself. And all of those that you can't separate those things out from one another. And so sometimes I think in these situations we intellectualize our faith in a way that is separate from the rest of us, right? When it's like what actually is the purpose of our reason, our rationality, our intellect, our mind. It's so that we can see reality, see God clearly. And
Mhm.
that's actually not just a set of facts that you assent to. It changes your imagination. It changes the way that you see the world, the way that you actually imagine the way things to be. It's a one key flip for this for me, and this is not the only thing, but I think it is a crucial one, is this idea of what is a doctrine for? What is
Mhm.
theology for? And for me, growing up, it really was this like, here are the correct answers to the test, so you can fill out your Scantron and submit it to the test machine on your way into heaven. And if you get an A, you can get in, you know?
Mhm.
And and certainly we want to have good theology, right? But
Mhm.
why? What is the purpose of that? It's so that we could see everything clearly. So this idea of flipping from doctrine as a test to doctrine as the script of a story was a massive, massive flip for me.
Yeah.
And there's a counter aspect of this, of realizing that we are all already believing other stories by default that we may not even be aware of. And so there's an infinite number of them that you could list, but here's just a few. The story of individualism, the story of consumerism, the story of expressive therapeutic culture, the expressive of moralistic therapeutic deism, the story of Christian nationalism, the story of, go on and on, progressivism, capital P progressivism, that everything's just going to
Mhm.
keep on getting better and all you have to do is be on the right side of history. These kinds of stories, that there is nothing self-evident about these stories. These are all stories that we are trained into. These are stories that we're sold into by marketers and corporations and
Mhm.
politicians, and that we just accept as default. We don't ever
Yeah.
question those. We don't deconstruct those the same way that we deconstruct our faith, right?
Mm.
And so some of this is realizing that the Bible, and through the Bible, doctrine, which is just a way of organizing the teachings of the Bible, is also telling you a story about reality. And if what it says is true, like what Paul says in Colossians, that in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, meaning you could open up Christ and reach in and never touch the bottom of the wisdom and knowledge that are in him, then that is going to be the true story of the world. And it is a counter to all these others. There are things about it that it incorporates, and there are things about it that it challenges.
Mhm.
um, but it is the true story, and all doctrine is lining yourself up with the true story, making sure that you're living in the right cinematic universe, but
Yeah.
of reality,
Mhm.
and playing your role in it, knowing what does it mean to play my role in this story. By playing my role in this story, what I mean is flourishing as a full human being, living under God, heart, soul, mind, body relationships, um, eating from the tree of life, the Psalm 1 life, that
Yeah.
meditating on the law of the Lord day and night. It's like someone
Yeah.
planted by a tree, planted by a stream of water. And that's the kind of life that we want to live. And that's one way of thinking about doctrine, of the true story of reality, and helping me see everything for what it is.
Yeah, I love that. I'm smiling because I like geek out over stories so much. That's like my passion is reading stories and I love to write them and I'm a big nerd and you mentioned like Lewis and Tolkien and some other universes in your book, but I love that framework for understanding our lives because and when we talked about this in past series on the Know Why podcast on creativity is like why are we drawn to stories as human beings? It's because we're living in one and the Bible is a story. And I think I'm just so glad you emphasized that because I really do think that helps when we are trying to understand who we are and what our purpose is understanding doctrine as the script, as the story that we are living in. And as you point out, like when you understand that, if you think of doctrine as a test, like you said, then it can be very restrictive and it can feel suffocating, like just a set, like a box that we're supposed to be inside. But when we understand it more as the script or as the framework of the reality that we're living in, then it can really be freeing, can't it?
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one way to, not to put too fine of a point on it, but if we're living in a false story, then we're quite literally not living in reality.
Hmm.
And so to live in God's story, to live under his rule and reign, to align ourselves with the way that he has created everything to be, is to live in reality. Um, and it, I don't know a finer way to put it than that. It's like a veil is lifted from above your eyes, and you just see everything for the way it is,
Mhm.
which gives a tremendous sense of meaning and purpose and value and dignity to everything in your life. It's like you go from black and white to color.
Mhm.
It's because you're finally in the story that you are made to be in.
Mhm. Yeah, and we just had an episode talking about how can I know what is true? And I think there is kind of a false sense of freedom or relief, even maybe when people walk away from the church or they start deconstructing things at first, because it seems like, well, hey, I don't know if that's the truth. Maybe truth is relative and, it's up to the individual. And at first, that can seem like a relief from what you felt was a very restrictive set of rules. But then uh, it actually becomes very difficult and very chaotic, and untethering was the word that Andrea, our guest, used whenever you feel like there isn't truth. And so I'm saying this poorly, but I think it relates to what you're saying of how, again, understanding the story that we live in, and when we can understand it rightly and work through maybe some of the pain and the false teachings that we had earlier on, it can actually bring a sense of freedom and security because we're not wandering around kind of lost looking for the truth anymore. We can be confident in what it is. But I loved the end. Um, and I feel like you end on such a hopeful note. And one thing that you said at the beginning of your book, I'm trying to remember the exact phrase, but it was like, I'm going to be defiantly hopeful or something like that.
I
Was
think I
that
said
what?
I was going to be brutally honest and defiantly hopeful.
Yeah, brutally honest and defiantly hopeful. And I really like that. And then at the end, I just think that hope comes through. And I love how you talk about Jesus as the ultimate deconstructor of death and then reconstructor of creation. So again, for somebody who maybe they're on that deconstruction journey and they're wondering if they can find hope again, can you kind of talk about that aspect of Jesus as the reconstructor?
It's a really good question. No one's ever asked me this specific question before, Liberty. Um, I don't think we feel the weight of death as much as we should.
Mm,
Um, and maybe I feel a little bit uniquely positioned to feel that just because of the experiences with it that I've had.
mm-hmm.
Um, because most of the people in my family have passed away. And so there's a profound sense of loss and loneliness that you experience through that.
Yeah.
And you realize that, well, let me put it this way. In the training program that I went through, there was a session that we talked about, and this completely reoriented so many things for me. Um, the teacher talked about this. He said, uh, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refers to death as the last enemy to be defeated. And he says, how many times do we refer to death as an enemy? Or how many times do we refer to death as a friend? Think about our funerals. Like, we don't have funerals anymore. We have celebration services. We just,
Yeah.
we do everything we can to cover over the actual sting of
Mm.
death and how hard it actually is. And this is what he said. He says, never call a friend what God calls an enemy.
Ooh.
Death is not this uh just this next state, just natural part of life. We were not made to die. You understand that, right?
Yeah.
Like, we were meant
Yeah.
to eat from the tree of life forever and ever and ever. And death is a curse on us, and it is an enemy to be defeated. And I don't think we meditate that on enough, even though throughout all of history, one of the cornerstones of wisdom is memento mori, remember your death. And we don't. We are so comfortable. We are so used to all of the things that try to push death off and de-age us and technology that we don't think about this, and we should, that we are mortal and we will die, and that
Mm-hmm.
is a curse on humanity, and it is not the way that it should be, and it is an enemy that needs to be defeated. And so when Christ actually dies and then defeats death and is resurrected, that, going back to 1 Corinthians 15, all it says, go look at it. It says he is the first fruits of the resurrection. What happened to Jesus is going to happen to us. in Christ, when we are united with him, we also are defeaters of death. We also will be raised. And we are out from under that curse, that it does not have the final word on us. And that all of the decay, all of the brokenness that we see in the world is actually, there's this seed that was planted into the ground that was Christ's body. And when it's raised, it's like the kingdom of God, right? And in his body, it's like a seed that sprouts and becomes a tree that covers the whole earth, and everybody finds a home in its branches. This
Wow.
is the story that we're living in.
Hmm.
All of creation is being reconstructed from the devil's deconstruction right now. It has been happening for 2,000 years and is going to continue happening until Jesus comes back. And all of us are invited into that, out of death and into life, out of the domain of darkness, into the kingdom of his beloved Son. And that's the invitation for all of us. And so, one of the things I talk about in the book is this idea of hope. We are shaped by what we hope for. And so, while I understand from firsthand experience the darkness and fear that is in deconstruction. And even though I didn't write this book for somebody who is deconstructing, even though I think it could be helpful for them, one thing that I would hope that they would take from it is this hope, this little bit of light in the darkness, that they would dig into the darkness of the soil and find a seed and go, oh, something is growing here. There actually is life here. There actually is light here. And if I can just walk towards that and water that, to mix all of my metaphors up, that there actually is life there. And to just read and meditate on Psalm 1 over and over and over again and say, that is the kind of life that I want. And in Christ, that's the life that we're given. That meditating on the law of the Lord day and night is eating from the tree of life. That being in Christ is to be in life itself. And that's the hope of the world.
Wow. Man, so well said, Ian. Yeah, I love that. And it seems counterintuitive to say that we need to fully experience and allow ourselves to experience something that's so painful, like death. And I think when you wrote, that we don't have funerals, we have celebrations of life. That can seem like a Christian thing, and I see this a lot in churches too. And it's like, yeah, we celebrate that they're with Jesus now, but it's like we don't even allow ourselves to be sad. It's like, no, no, don't be sad. Um, but we need to feel the pain so that we can appreciate the defeat of it, and the light and the hope and the healing. And then it makes me think about, and I wasn't necessarily raised in a liturgical church, but even the seasons like Lent. And
Yes.
it's like, wow, there is a reason why as Christians, like, we have certain times built in, or we should, to allow ourselves to mourn. It's not supposed to be some sort of toxic positivity, because that actually makes it more shallow. And maybe if people were felt, I don't know, like they were allowed to experience the full range of emotions and kind of the bittersweetness of that. I don't know. I think we would have more of a full experience as humans in the church, which is what God intends for us, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's a can of worms. I have so many thoughts about that, but I mean, I think so. I think one of the ways that these ideas, this theology, this culture gets, um, and I mean this word positively, indoctrinated literally
Hmm.
into out of our minds and into our bodies, is through the liturgy of our services.
Hmm.
And so this is why, I kind of go to like this weird hybrid church where it's like we're a low church, but we incorporate all of these liturgical things. Um, and I could talk about this for a whole nother hour. I know we don't have that liberty, but um,
Another episode.
yeah, that's right, another episode just on this. But um, maybe I'll tell two stories.
Okay.
I'll make them as quick as I can. A couple of years ago, my family experienced another very hard situation, and it happened right before Lent. It happened,
Mm.
and so we were mourning that, and we went into that. We just sort of realized, oh, it's it's Ash Wednesday. We're going into Lent. And like, here is an entire time of the calendar that has been marked out for remembering our sin and our suffering and taking it before God, and just sitting in our need for him,
Mhm.
and being allowed to feel the weight of that. And it's all leading up to this resurrection that does exactly what we just talked about of the defeat of death. That's the celebration, right? Um, and so you are able to hold those two things in tension at the exact same time. The fact that there is a season of darkness and there is a season of light. There's a season of death and a season of resurrection. And in the church calendar, I think you have opportunity to go through those seasons every year, and,
Mhm.
and be able to sit in them. And you won't need them the same time every year, but that's not the point. You don't know what life is going to bring to you. And that's why the rhythm of it is actually so good, because it's always coming back around and you don't know when you're going to need it. The second story, it's not really a story as much as just like a way of thinking about it is, our church, we do the Lord's Supper every week. And I've become a really, really big believer in this, for many reasons. But one of them on this topic of deconstruction is if you think about someone who's going through these things, who's doubting, who is um, not sure what they believe, who's really wrestling with their faith, um, doing the Lord's Supper every week is a way to invite them to the table and say, receive the body and blood of Christ, receive his grace for you through this meal with us. We are inviting you to the table because we, as a people, as God's people, are affirming your profession of faith, even if it's difficult for you right now. We are holding your faith for you, even when it is hard for you to hold it yourself. And there's just something about that reality of, and it's the exact opposite of what I feel like I experienced. Instead of this anxious rejection, feeling threatened, it's this warm, hospitable, we affirm you. Come to the table. You are one of us. You are part of the people of God. You have been rescued and ransomed and saved and redeemed, and just like we have been. And so,
Mhm.
even though you don't have all of your answers or everything figured out right now, that's okay. Come to the table.
Yep.
And I think a weekly affirmation of that, rather than this sort of every now and then or every quarter or whatever, like being able to do that week in and week out habituates those truths into your body in ways that a sermon or a podcast or a book just can't do.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so good. There is so much good to discuss there, but I think all of that is just so hopeful, and again, it points to the wisdom of God and his, and again, his goodness in recognizing our need for those different seasons and those affirmations at hard times in our lives, and instead of abandoning us to them to just kind of float around and figure it out on our own, he has given us ways to sit with those emotions and experience them and acknowledge all of that. So anyway, Ian, your book is great. I definitely recommend it. Again, Walking Through Deconstruction. We'll link it. And are there any other resources that you want to recommend for people, or just parting words?
Oh man. Um if you're going through this is normal. This is so normal. Um Christians have done this forever. Um and I don't know. If I could recommend one book, it's Confessions. Go read Augustine's Confessions. And I know it's intimidating, and don't let it be. Just do it. It's way
Hmm.
more readable than you think. I know Augustine gets a bad rap in deconstruction circles, and I just question if anyone has actually read him. Go read it. I think you will be surprised at the friend that you find.
Great stuff. We'll link that too. And Ian, thank you for being on the Know Why podcast.
Thanks for having me, Liberty.